Rated Hospital, here for you when you need us. From emergency care to routine checkups and screenings, caregivers are here and ready to provide the safe, high-quality care you need close to home. Online at sanjuanregional.com with the latest health information and resources to help you live life better here. Minutes past 8 o'clock. It is Thursday morning, the second day of December 2021. Good morning, everyone. I'm Scott Michlin, and thank you for tuning in to KSJE 90.9 FM over the air, of course, here in San Juan County, 103.3 FM in Durango, Colorado, and streaming everywhere else on Earth from our website at ksje.com. Welcome also to our viewers who are watching this visual radio program. It is streaming live this morning out to the KSJE Facebook page, our YouTube channel, and our Twitter account. We're glad that you're with us, everybody, because coming up this morning, my guest on the program, archaeologist Paul Reed, is here to talk a little bit about some reports on federal oil and gas leasing, what that means for New Mexico and other places throughout the West, and much, much more. And certainly we'll be talking about Chaco Canyon, a favorite topic of both of ours, coming up on the program this morning. So stand by for that, coming up in the next few minutes. Next hour, Mick Hess is going to be here. He'll take us roving with the arts. Mick is playing for us today a Christmas cantata by Arthur Honegger. That's coming up today on Roving with the Arts on KSJE. Don't forget, we invite you to connect with us on social media. In addition to Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, you can check us out on our Instagram page as well. In fact, we just posted a video of our entry for this year's Festival of Trees. You can see that on our social media accounts, and then maybe go see it in person at Boone's Thai Restaurant in downtown Farmington as the Festival of Trees gets underway today and for the next several days. Let's talk a little bit about podcasts, too. We invite you to subscribe for free to KSJE's podcast. Wherever you listen to podcasts, you can check us out and take us with you wherever your travels may take you this holiday season. So subscribe and check them out on all the popular podcast apps. Outside our studios here at San Juan College, it is a sunny morning this morning, 31 degrees in Farmington. We are expecting a day of increasing sunshine. The high 56 in Farmington this afternoon, 25 overnight. 56 again tomorrow with an overnight low of 24 on Friday. Mostly sunny on Saturday with a high of 57. 55 on Sunday, 52 on Monday. We're taking and keeping an eye on the storm that may be moving in Monday night into Tuesday with a chance of some snow showers Monday night on into Tuesday with rain and snow mixed, and a high on Tuesday only about 46 degrees. Well, let me turn to my guest who is here with us this morning, as I mentioned, to talk a little bit about federal oil and gas leasing and some other topics, of course. Paul Reed, local archaeologist who works with Salmon Ruins and Archaeology Southwest. Paul, always glad to have you on the program. Good morning.
Good morning, Scott. Glad to be back on with you.
You bet. Thank you for being here. And so, as I mentioned, the topic this morning is this kind of changes and proposed changes to federal oil and gas leasing. I guess we'll talk about that in a moment, but I guess the other big topic is you were at Chaco Canyon along with the Secretary of the Interior just a week or so ago. And so let's talk a little bit about that event.
Yeah, it was a great event. Secretary Deb Haaland was there to talk about the Biden administration's and her Interior Department's plan to withdraw the federal surface, the BLM lands in the 10-mile zones that we've been talking about now for several years from oil and gas leasing for a period of 20 years. And this is huge. I can't emphasize enough how important this is to protect Chaco Canyon itself in the sense of some kind of a buffer zone. But, Scott, when we talk about this, I don't really even like the word buffer zone, because for me, it's more about a protection zone around Chaco, but also to protect those sites, those sacred places that are beyond the park's limits. I was particularly excited to be there. There were many Pueblo leaders, the All Pueblo Council of Governors, Governor Brian Vio, one of our main partners at Acoma, the vice chairman of the Hopi tribe, Lieutenant Governor Bowie Katie of Zuni Pueblo, local Navajo Councilman Daniel So, just really an all-star group of folks who've worked really hard on this.
Right, which I guess shows, too, the amount of support that this idea and this proposal has received from the Native American community and others who certainly have a connection to that very sacred area, right?
That's exactly right. And again, as we've talked many, many times on the show, this isn't about the end of oil and gas. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about removing lands that are not that good for oil and gas development in the first place from leasing, protecting our special important places, and just pushing the oil and gas somewhere where it won't have any potential impacts on places that, we universally acknowledge in New Mexico, in the United States, and really across the world, because we're talking about the World Heritage sites that are in Chaco Canyon and all the affiliated World Heritage sites that are beyond the boundaries. So yeah, these are places, these are landscapes that, a vast majority of people in our state and in our country agree are important to protect. So yeah, it's again, just an amazing process to be part of.
Right. And so, again, this is on federal land, but as you have told us time and time again, that area around Chaco Canyon is kind of a checkerboard, literally, of different types of land. And so what's next, I guess? Is there still a push to protect and maybe have the same thing in effect on those other lands that aren't controlled by the federal government?
Well, the checkerboard status is really, one of the big challenges for land management out in this area to begin with. So these parcels of land that the BLM, owns and controls the surface of is about 300,000, a little more than that, acres. The entire area encompassed by these, the proposed zones of protection is something over 1 million acres. So, we're not even close to half of the land that's in there. Now our state land commissioner, Stephanie Garcia Richard, did withdraw oil and gas activities on 77,000 acres of state trust land. That was 3 years ago now. And, so that was a great move. But yeah, we still have a whole lot of land that's potentially developable for oil and gas through different Navajo allotment holders. And, so that's an ongoing process to see how to balance the needs of folks to have economic activity, and opportunities to succeed in our capitalistic economy, of course, versus protection of important places. So, those discussions are continuing, and I think local leaders out there and our congressional delegation are really engaged in that.
Right. And so the cynic in me may be thinking, and I am thinking this, and maybe you can address it, Paul Reed, is you mentioned that this decision by the Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, is good for 20 years. What's to keep the next Secretary of Interior, maybe from a different political party or what have you, from issuing a new decision that maybe ends that or shortens that or does away with it or anything like that? It doesn't seem like there's any really permanence in this decision unless there's maybe congressional action or something else. Am I on the right track, or is that not what you're thinking?
No, that's absolutely the case, Scott. So this is an administrative action through the Department of Interior and the Bureau of Land Management. So, a new administration could definitely go through the process of overturning this. But I think one of the things, and I'll return to the notion of a bill here in a second, but one of the things that I think may prevent that is the process that the Biden administration and Secretary Haaland have agreed to go through. They're talking about a 2-year process that would start early next year to totally vet this withdrawal of these lands, to have hearings, to go through public comment periods, and hopefully bring folks who might have some opposition at this point to it into the fold. And again, to go through a full process so everyone has their say. So I think it's possible with that sort of a process that this wouldn't be overturned, depending upon a new administration in the future. But, as you mentioned, what would really sort of put this in place for us on a permanent basis is to get a Chaco protection bill through the Congress. And as we've talked on the show, we had a bill get through the House in 2019 and then basically hit, no action essentially in the Senate throughout, the remaining months of 2019 all the way through last year, and then expire, as we had our election. So we do have our congressional leaders poised to introduce a new version of that bill that addresses some of the concerns that were raised out in the checkerboard area around Chaco. And so we're optimistic that that can be introduced early next year and begin to make its way through. In the meantime, this administrative action will protect this 10-mile zone for at least the next several years as we go through this process.
Right. And it sounds to me like some of these steps that you mentioned that the Secretary and the Biden administration are going through, maybe to show a bit of transparency in how they're coming to this decision. But I guess also then if someone were to overturn it, that if there was a court challenge, because that's usually where things end up these days, that perhaps the courts might side with the Biden administration, even if they're out of office by the time that challenge comes up. Is that something too?
That's right. And as we've seen with the Bears Ears monument designation, the shrinking of it by the prior administration, and then returning it to its boundaries very recently, which, we're thrilled with from a conservation and preservation point of view. These things do end up in the courts, as you said, and that's hard to predict as we go through that process. But I do think this administration is taking pains to move slowly and to be completely transparent as this process unfolds. And for me, I don't think you can do public policy really much better than that.
Right. Understood. And certainly, as we've talked on this program many times, there's a lot of different opinions out there, and a lot of folks, and it's the job of the Interior Department to manage these public lands, and we've talked about the Bureau of Land Management and some of the ways that they do that, and to be able to kind of balance the idea between protection and development and recreation and livestock and grazing and all those different things that the public lands are used for, not just here in New Mexico, but across the West, right?
Right. And it's not an enviable task that the BLM has. They manage almost 250 million acres of surface and, quite a bit more than that in the subsurface across the West. It's a balancing act, and it's tricky. One of the things we've emphasized all along in working to protect these 10-mile zones that intersect around Chaco is that these lands are not that productive for oil and gas anyway. As we look at the way the Mancos Shale development in particular has unfolded now over more than a decade, none of the areas that have been produced the most oil, they're not that close to Chaco. They're further out to the north and the east. So this 10-mile zone isn't prime country for oil and gas development, and that's why it's so important, what we're going to talk about, in a little bit on the show, that the Biden administration is thinking of ways to emphasize moderate and high production areas in oil and gas leasing, and maybe curtail some of this basic speculation on marginal lands that are unlikely to ever contribute any real oil to our country's supply. So that's where we're kind of coming down on this. So there are reasons from archaeological, cultural points of view to protect this zone, and there's really no big industry push to drill down there because, again, it's too much work. The way it's described to me by the geologists is the Mancos Shale, as you go further south, gets wet. So there's a lot more water, there's a lot more processing to get to the petroleum product ultimately. So this is not prime country for oil and gas. So there's really no reason not to take it off the table. So I think this is going to be a win-win ultimately. Right.
And I guess a lot of armchair economists like me may say, though, but if the price of oil goes to, $100 a barrel or $150 a barrel or whatever, it maybe makes those maybe not so lucrative parcels a lot more attractive as the price gets higher. And is that the concern maybe that you'd like to have some more permanent protections to guard against this?
Yeah, exactly. And the real question we have to ask ourselves as a society is, making profits for oil companies, is that more important than protecting places that have been on the landscape for more than 1,000 years, in some cases several thousand years, and whether, what kind of balance we want in this society ultimately, whether, again, producing profit for oil companies and a few shareholders outbalances the needs of millions of people to enjoy a place without the intrusion of an industrial landscape, and that's ultimately the quality of life issue that all of us have to, I think, consider and ponder very deeply.
Right, right. We'd be talking about the development underground, but would this also, I assume, protect some of the viewscapes above ground of the area around Chaco Canyon? You know, we always talk about that when you go to Chaco and have gotten through that dirt road that is what it is. But when you get there, it is such a unique place and a quiet place, and you can kind of tell you're in a special place. But to look out at the horizon and again kind of see it unchanged, is this also a protection of that part of Chaco Canyon as well?
It absolutely is, Scott. And, you know, that's what we've been increasingly sort of considering as we look at ways to protect Chaco on the sites outside, as we talk about auditory effects, you know, the noise of oil and gas development or other developments, and then the visual effects of seeing well pads, power lines to power them in some cases, storage tanks, you know, all that infrastructure, and what that actually does to the qualities of these historic places, these sacred places, that make them, you know, universally protectable places on our landscapes. And again, this is not a, you know, protect sites or have oil and gas. It's where do we do the oil and gas responsibly, carefully, so that we're not impacting, you know, these special places. And, you know, Chaco Canyon is one of the most special places on the planet. So in some ways, it is surprising to me, and I know some of my tribal colleagues and friends have mentioned this as well. It's surprising that we're even having this level of discussion, and that a 10-mile protective zone around Chaco is just not a slam dunk. There are so many other places that don't have centers like Chaco that could, and, you know, are currently being, you know, tapped for oil and gas development, that we don't need these lands around Chaco that aren't going to contribute much to the nation's supply of oil anyway. So it's back to where we want that bar to go on our balancing act here.
Right. Right. And I always want to remind everybody, our audiences that are listening and watching us this morning, Paul Reed, that the park itself has never been threatened. Chaco Canyon Culture Park has always been protected and will continue to be. It is what we're talking about as this area outside of the park boundaries. And as you mentioned now, this 10-mile zone that would be kind of taken off the books, if you will, for federal, for oil and gas leasing on federal land, and that's what we're talking about. But the park itself is not endangered or threatened in any way. But as you have told us numerous times, there are a lot more artifacts, a lot more settlements, a lot more parts of Greater Chaco that fall outside of those park boundaries that require our attention.
Well, that's right, and you know, it's wonderful that we have such a great park system in our country, and we have, I think, over 500 places that are either historic sites, monuments, or national parks protected for natural or cultural values. But we have a whole lot of other lands in the country that are also very important. So, and those are mostly managed by either BLM or the U.S. Forest Service, and these areas deserve a lot of attention and consideration as well as we work through this equation. So what I don't want folks to think is that we've protected all the important places, and they're in the parks, they're in the monuments, and life is good. We still have a number of places that deserve different levels of protection, and that's why this is a fairly lengthy process, certainly, and one that we should pay a lot of attention to.
Right. Would it ever make sense, Paul Reed, to expand the boundaries of Chaco Canyon Park to a 10-mile radius or a 7-mile radius or something like that, just to make it all park boundary?
I think
that'd be a big expansion, I understand.
Yeah, I think at various times people have considered that, but there's a lot of interest in there in terms of the Navajo families who live in the area,
right,
on allotments that they've had in many cases for over 120 years at this point. So I think that is probably not the best possible solution at this point. I think we would just like to, you know, improve the management of the lands that are, you know, managed by the government, the BLM, you know, our state trust lands, and, you know, the allotted lands and the few parcels of Navajo Nation tribal trusts, you know, that have tribal ownership and or some BIA input as well. So the hope really is to just manage these lands better for all of the users out there. But you know, the checkerboard nature, as we've been discussing, really does complicate that tremendously. Right.
My guest this morning, local archaeologist Paul Reed, who works with Salmon Ruins and Archaeology Southwest, talking a little bit about the decision by the new Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, to again pause and study federal leasing on lands around the Chaco Canyon area for the next 20 years. And this leads us into the next part of our discussion this morning, Paul Reed, is about this, I guess, bigger view of kind of reforming rules about federal leasing or leasing on federal lands. And I know Archaeologist Southwest issued an opinion piece about that. You shared that with me as well, that I want to share on the screen this morning about your positive reaction to that, because that's a big change too, is it not?
It is, and this is something that we've been talking about for some time, going back into the prior administration, but in particular during this calendar year of 2021. I had put together a report with some input from different colleagues on this very issue, the leasing issue, and shared that with some BLM officials. And we had gone through a process of talking about it, getting some positive press attention. Meanwhile, this process of BLM looking at reforming the leasing process has moved forward, and they have now released this report. And I think it could fundamentally change how we think about oil and gas leasing in the West. And that there's a number of things in here that are, to my mind, very positive, to make this a much more thoughtful process, to not have it be totally driven by trying to lease every remaining parcel of land in the West. Folks may not be aware, but across the West, we have a very high percentage of public lands that are already under a lease, might be developing, producing oil and gas right now. And that number is over 80% in the West. In the Farmington area, in the Farmington field office, the number approaches more like 92% of it. So this area we're talking about in Chaco's 10-mile, the overlapping zones there, is something like 4 or 5% of that remaining 8%. So the level of leasing is very, very high at this point, and some of these remaining lands can be accessed from current points that already have either current leases or current oil and gas infrastructure on them. So that is something that the current administration is trying to highlight. The other thing they want to do, as I mentioned earlier, is really focus on the lands in the West that have moderate or high potential for oil and gas production. And this is totally independent of price. So this isn't about whether a company is going to make money, or the price of oil at the time. Is there high potential to produce oil and gas that, yes, the country needs and we need to continue to, pull out of the ground? Or is this an area of low potential or very mediocre potential where the environmental costs, the potential cultural costs of losing cultural landscapes or impacts to those landscapes is just too high compared to the payoff? And this is something that honestly hasn't been pursued at any point in the last 40 or 50 years. We have assumed that oil and gas production is what we should be doing on BLM federal lands when it's possible, and not whether it's actually a good idea to do it, compared to the nation's supply of oil and a whole lot of other factors. So I think from my standpoint, that's a very positive development. The other side is to adjust royalty rates. Right now, the federal government gets about 12.5% of the total net profit from any particular well or set of leases. On state lands, that number is over 20%. So the feds are way behind on this. This rate has not been adjusted in decades, literally. So I think that's something that we should really consider. And the third thing, just real quick, Scott, is... Sure. On this is that they want to increase bonding levels for these wells. So what happens a lot of times is we have inadequate bonds put up, something like $10,000 or $15,000 for each wellhead, and then those wellheads stop producing. Companies transfer assets, they move on. Companies go bankrupt at times, and basically the taxpayers at the state level and the federal level are responsible for all this cleanup. So, and the cost of cleaning up wells gets into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. So, it should be pretty clear that a $15,000 or $20,000 bond is not adequate to ensure that a landscape is restored as close as we can get it once that oil and gas development is finished. So those are three pretty positive things that I think are coming out of this leasing report.
Got you. And Paul, I think we just have to look at some current legislation too. I believe Senator Lujan has introduced it about orphaned wells. And I think there was some, wasn't there some money in the infrastructure package, one of the bills? I'm forgetting which one, to maybe address that issue as well. And we know here in the San Juan Basin, we have a lot of so-called orphaned wells that are maybe no longer producing natural gas or oil, and need to be properly sealed and shut down and things along that line. Am I on the right track?
Yeah, definitely. And part of the need for that legislation is private companies are allowed to, exploit this, pay whatever royalty rates in place, step aside, transfer assets, in many cases go bankrupt, and they're not responsible for the cleanup of that. That falls to the states or to the feds. And that's an appalling situation. I don't, there's no other industry where we allow that to happen so routinely. So this is some long needed reform here, and we really shouldn't ultimately have to spend taxpayer money to clean up private enterprises messes. And of course this does happen. We have Superfund sites, so that is the unfortunate political reality of our society and has been for a few decades. But as we look to the future, it makes a tremendous amount of sense to just have enough money put into accounts to cover the cleanup costs, because we know what those are. It's not some big mystery at this point. This oil field is 100 years old at this point, and we can start treating the rehabilitation process as responsibly as every other part of it. So I think, it's time to do that.
Right. And for the industry, I guess it gives them a better idea of what their total costs will be when they move into a parcel or go into an area, right? They know that they have to set aside X number of dollars for these bonds and their responsibility to clean this up if and when the well stops producing and all those things. I imagine that when these oil and gas companies move into an area or decide to buy or pay for a lease or bid on a lease, they've done all those calculations. Somebody with a calculator somewhere in that organization has done the cost analysis to figure out if it's worth their time and their effort and their money.
That's right. And if we have appropriate bonding levels, it's possible those companies would reach the conclusion that these lower potential areas really are not worth it from an economically feasible standpoint, aside from all the other concerns we're talking about. And I think that's simply a matter of being a responsible company working in a diverse society, protecting the values that people universally want to see protected. And so, I don't think that's a particularly radical concept.
No, it doesn't sound like it, but some may think that it is. And again, I think, to be fair, some oil and gas companies, I would maybe say many oil and gas companies, are responsible. There are those few bad apples in any industry that kind of ruin it for everyone else. I don't know if you would agree with me on that, but it seems like I think most try to do the right thing.
No, I would agree with you, Scott. And the thing is, what we've seen in the transition in the oil field south of Farmington is the really big producers being involved when the Mancos Shale was producing really well and the price of oil was high enough to maintain that. And then we saw those first tier producers like ConocoPhillips, which, as we know, did a pretty big pull out of Farmington a few years ago. We had a multinational company called Encana doing a lot of drilling. They sold out to sort of secondary level producers who did, some oil and gas production, and then they've now passed it down to tertiary producers. So the question we have is really, are we still getting adequate returns compared to the potential natural and cultural impacts of this in an oil field that is no longer producing that well? So, and these are questions we don't normally ask. We assume, again, that oil and gas production is a good thing and that it should continue. But, we're seeing some real changes in our country in terms of green energy stepping up and really getting serious about a transition to a post oil and gas, environment. And these are the things we should be thinking about. And we should be sure that any oil and gas that we put in place now moving forward is clean upable, is properly funded, and is done as responsibly as it can possibly be. So those are the things that we're interested in, that a lot of our partners are interested in, that
right.
All the tribes are interested in.
Right. And as you mentioned, the fields here are 100 years old, just celebrated the 100th anniversary of the first gas well in San Juan County last month, as I recall, or 2 months ago in October. But that makes me think about the oil fields southeast in the southeast part of the state, the Permian Basin, and a much younger field, and still, but the same problems, same potential problems there. And this would cover that as well. It would cover throughout the West.
That's right, and the Permian is producing a ton of oil right now, and it's and that's helping to fuel our economy and other things, and so we just have to balance that. The question is whether the oil field south of Farmington really needs to be in production if we're getting to the oil easier, more economically down in the southeast, and how we balance those values. There are archaeological values down there. There are cultural landscapes. There are natural landscapes. But they're not exactly the same as what we're dealing with around Chaco. So I think the point is that we can evaluate different areas with an eye towards cultural and natural protections and figure out how to do that and have a balanced approach to the full range of the oil and gas activities, from exploration all the way through rehabilitation. And that's the direction I think the Biden administration wants to head. So I think that's very positive.
Right. But I guess, Paul Reed, does that mean that both sides need to agree on the science of geology moving forward?
I hope they do, because there are certain geologic facts that I don't believe are in dispute. It's not my primary field. But
understood.
Yeah.
I only say that because after the last 18 months, we tend to poke at anything that we wonder about and wonder if it's true and try to get the other side to agree with us. So that's the reason I brought it up.
That's true, and we've had, as gently as I can put it, a variety of different worldviews and realities emerge that definitely sometimes we have trouble reconciling at the national and the state level. So I think one of the things that I'm very encouraged by with the Biden administration is, as you mentioned earlier, the openness, the transparency of a process that says, here's what we would like to do. With circling back to the Chaco withdrawal and the 20-year, proposed date on that. Right. That was announced, and it wasn't said that, okay, this is in place by April 1, get us your comments. No worries. They've outlined a 2-year process to take comment, to do some hearings, and to go through a very full discussion and dialogue on this, which I think is absolutely commendable. And at the end of that process, I doubt that all the parties are going to feel like all of their questions have been perfectly addressed, or that their skepticism is now addressed and they're ready to sign on fully. But it is part of what we have to continue to do in the country with, sort of the divisions that we have, obviously, at the national and the state level, is just to have as full a dialogue as possible, and to have folks be heard, and then reach decisions at the end that are going to meet, as many people's needs as we can meet. That's what we do in a democracy. Right.
Very true. Very diplomatically said, Paul Reed. And with that, I think we will end our conversation this month because we're also out of time. But I always appreciate your time and insights and sharing some of this news with our audiences. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Scott. Glad to be here.
Great, Paul. Take care. Thank you so much. And Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to you and your family. We'll talk again in January.
Thank you. Same to you.
All right. Very good. That's Paul Reed, Archaeology Southwest and Salmon Ruins, my guest this morning with me here on KSJE. KSJE is supported by the Farmington Civic Center, bringing a wide variety of live entertainment to the Four Corners. Country music, classic rock, and ballet, all on stage this fall. Also, on-stage theatrical performances of The Rocky Horror Show and the holiday classic A Christmas Carol. Find out more online at fmtn.org/shows.
When it comes to moderating what gets